In this section, I'm going to reveal some key lessons from the book Hitmakers: The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction. Okay, one of the first key conclusions we can draw here is that there is a myth of novelty. The world seems like it's obsessed with things because they're new. When we look at advertising gurus like David Ogilvy and John Caples, they often talk about how you should make headlines new, announcing, introducing, because this is what gets people's attention. But in actuality, people are drawn to new ideas that remind them of old ideas. So really what people like is things that are familiar. And in fact, this is one of the most conclusive things we have in marketing psychology. People like things that are familiar. In fact, you can just artificially increase familiarity by exposing people to the same thing repeatedly, and they'll like it more just because they've seen it more often. They like songs that they're familiar with, they like storylines they're familiar with, and they like styles that they're familiar with. More than anything, they love the recognition of a familiar pattern in a fresh setting. So, because familiarity is such a strong motivator and something that makes things popular, what you want to do as somebody that wants to become famous is align yourself with familiar ideas and make yourself familiar by doing things like running advertising to promote your brand and increasing the frequency so that people see you more and more often. To quote Dale Carnegie, to be remembered, be repetitive. So being repetitive means using something like the same photo of yourself over and over in the same advertising and running that ad repeatedly to the same target audience. Now, a little mini case study I want to demonstrate here is the franchise Avatar. Original Avatar was a huge hit. We're talking breaking records in terms of revenue for the box office. But Avatar is really just an old story. It's really just the story of Dances with Wolves, which is the story of Pocahontas, which is the same as the story of The Last Samurai. There's really nothing that unique about it. But what they did is they just took those same stories and put them in a sci-fi futuristic setting instead of an old setting. So they took an old recipe that everybody's familiar with, everybody's already in love with, things that people can already predict, and they just made some superficial changes to make it a little fresher, a little more interesting. And that's how things become famous. That's how Avatar became the most famous movie in the world. You take an old recipe and you just make some superficial changes. And we also see Avatar 2 coming out. What are they doing? They're just taking a franchise that was already successful and changing the setting a bit with a new story. Now, if we take a look at the book How Brands Grow, this also talks about how people love being reminded about what they already believe. They're not really that receptive to hearing things that are new. And in fact, this is why a lot of advertising doesn't work, because you're trying to force people to adapt new ideas, new products, new concepts, new personal brands, etc. Now, another key conclusion that we have from this book is the myth of virality. Most popular ideas don't typically spread like viruses. Instead, they depend on diffuse broadcasts, where one source infects many people at once. One website, one TV show, or one celebrity distributed the content to many people at once. So what we see here is really in the research, whether we're looking at this book or we're looking at Byron Sharp's research on how brands grow, is this idea that broadcasts matter. Mass market matters. So broadcast, let's just look at that word for a minute. It's broadcast. So it's like casting a broad net. So the way that I think of virality in the real world is more like fishing with a net. You're casting this huge net out in the ocean and you're capturing a lot of people all at once. But if you look at how most marketers approach marketing and trying to become famous, they're doing the opposite. They're doing spearfishing. They're taking one fish and they say, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go after this very tiny micro audience. And then once I get them, word of mouth is going to spread. And then suddenly I'm going to become really popular. And it just never happens. It never manifests. So think of how you can leverage broadcasts. Let's explore this idea that virality is a myth further. So for example, the vast majority of the news that people see on Twitter, around 95%, comes directly from its original source or from one degree of separation. Popularity on the internet is driven by the size of the largest broadcast. It's not democratic. It's not a whole bunch of people spreading words to one another, to their friends, to their families, etc. It's usually one giant broadcast. That's the key thing you need to focus on. Marketers vastly overestimate the reliable power of word of mouth. Now, there are lots of gurus out there. People like Seth Godin here, Simon Sinek, people that write influencer advice. The problem is they're basically just telling you what you want to hear, which is that word of mouth is the key. Getting people to fall in love with your brand or your personal brand is the key. None of this stacks up to real evidence. So Seth Godin is talking about how modern marketing is all about word of mouth, but statistically we know that's not really true. It's more about large broadcasts. It's more like mass marketing that people did decades ago. That's really what works in the past, and it's what works today. Most people generally prefer ideas that they already agree with, images that are easy to discern, stories that are easy to relate to, and puzzles that are easy to solve. When something becomes hard to think about, people transfer the discomfort of the thought to the object of their thinking. So one example that I like to cite here is Simon Sinek. He basically just tells people what they want to hear or what they already believe. He's telling people feel-good ideas or ideas that are lurking in the back of their head. But a lot of the time, what he's saying is just completely wrong. It goes against the evidence. It goes against key success factors that we can see. Really, what he's doing, in the words of this book, Hitmakers, is he's reselling common sense. Now, Simon Sinek isn't cited in this book. They're not talking about him as a case study, but I'm talking about him because he's become renowned for doing exactly what a lot of these successful people do with books, which is resell common sense, even when common sense is just completely wrong. So another key thing that we can discern here is that superficial changes are often better than substantive ones. So people don't actually want something different. They don't want another personality that's unique or a different perspective. What they want is the old things that they already like repackaged in a superficial way. So for example, a lot of businesses have realized that we don't actually need to change our products to get people to buy again. We just need to change the color. A bold new red version of something you already love, and people will shell out money for that because that's what they love. They love old things that they already like, but that are glittery and change in fashion. Another example, again, is Avatar. It's basically just Dances with Wolves, but with aliens. Now, another demonstration of this is when we look at the research of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And what we see is that what really matters in terms of making a brand memorable are superficial differences. So the word they use is distinctiveness, as opposed to differentiation. Now, a lot of marketing strategists are going to talk about how you need to fundamentally differentiate yourself. You need to find some sort of niche market. That's not really true. At least it's not true when you want to be famous. What you need to do is be unique in a superficial way. So you're the bald guy, you're the girl with the bold glasses, you're the one who wears bees on her shirts on YouTube all the time. That makes you memorable in a superficial way. But the substance of what you're saying, people just want to hear what they already believe for the most part. So this raises the question, is uniqueness overrated? Now, there's this famous book out there in business called The Blue Ocean Strategy that I've been very critical of. And basically, it's advocating this idea you need to find a unique space in the market. And sure, maybe there are cases where that's possible, but you're not going to get very famous by doing that kind of niche marketing strategy. So is uniqueness overrated? So generally, yes, it's overrated when it comes to real difference. When there's actually a substantial difference between you or your brand and the other popular ones that are out there. You're better off just replicating what they're doing. But uniqueness is important when it comes to superficial differences. Differences that don't actually change the underlying value of what you're saying or the value proposition. So to quote the book, if you find a story that clicks, keep churning out new episodes. So for example, when you're producing something like YouTube videos, look at what's already popular. Look at what's been trending in the last week, in the last month, in the last year. Create a version of it or multiple versions. See what's a big hit and then just keep doing more and more things similar to that. People love hearing the same thing over and over and over, especially if it's something they already believe or is consistent with their values. So, one of the formulas for fame is to take something people love and change it just slightly. So, let's say there are 30 variables that define a popular action movie. Do 29 of them and just take one thing and make it really different. So, put it in space or give it a female lead when it usually has a male lead. Just some little thing where people are like, hey, this is new, this is fresh, but it's also comfortable because it's what I'm familiar with. There's a really interesting study done by Harvard and Northeastern University. And what they were studying was proposals, okay? Proposals to get money. Here's what they found. The worst ratings were the proposals that were the most novel. So the most unique, the most different. Those were the worst. Those were the ones that were rejected at the highest probability. The best ratings were ones that were, for the most part, completely familiar, things that had already gotten funding before, but they were just slightly new, just acceptably enough different that it was able to be remembered and get more attention. So that's really what people want, familiar things in new packaging with slight changes. Okay, so one of the challenges with becoming famous, especially when you're doing something like entertainment, is that there's a bit of chaos, right? Not every attempt at becoming a blockbuster is a success. And you might say, well, then there's no real science to fame. And that's not really true. And one of the reasons is that you can control chaos. And the way you do that is by owning or manipulating or influencing the channels of distribution. And that's really where the battle for fame is happening. It's a battle for distribution, a battle for reach. And to quote the book, the problem with owning too much distribution is not that it doesn't work. Rather, it works so well that it's illegal in some contexts. The next best solution is to surround the audience with advertising to ensure that every consumer who might be interested in a new product is aware of it. And I showed you some examples earlier in this course where I showed how in TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the advertising channels, you can choose reach and awareness as your objective. And there you have it, advertising to a mass market. It's not very expensive. You could take a budget of, say, $4 a day, usually $5 a day minimum, and reach as many people as possible to help establish and grow your personal brand. Not a lot of money. So one of the key psychological principles I talked about here is the idea of familiarity. People like things that they've already been exposed to, if for no other reason that they've been exposed to it before. But people also like things because they think other people like them. So I mentioned the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa got famous not because it's a great painting, but because of the media that gave it a lot of attention. The other reason people like the Mona Lisa is because other people like the Mona Lisa. They think it's great, therefore you think you should think it's great, and you do think it's great. So one of the ways that this was manipulated in a study was this organization took a bunch of rankings for music, and they basically manipulated it to create superstars. So they took a list from top to bottom of the most popular songs, and they inverted it. So the worst songs showed up at the top of the list. And guess what ended up happening? The ones at the top of the list, the songs that were poorly rated before, became really popular and people really liked them because people are easily manipulated by social pressure and consensus. This is something that marketing psychologists have found consistently over time. If you read the book Influence, Robert Cialdini has demonstrated this over and over again. Now, back in my early days of marketing, I did something that was a little bit sketchy, a little bit questionable. Maybe I wouldn't do it today, but I ran a Google ad for web design services that I was marketing at the time. But instead of running the ad to my homepage or my landing page, what I did was I created a special page. And that special page was a ranking of the top web design companies in my city. And I listed them up from 1 to 10, and guess who I put at the top? Me. I put my company at the very top of the list, and there was a link to my company page, and it was successful. I almost immediately landed a large contract because people trust rankings, even when they're arbitrary, even when they don't understand the methodology. But there's this sense of social consensus because humans are social animals. They trust the opinions of other social animals.